I'll look to Katie to give us progress updates on the 2025 stock assessments.
Great, thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm going to be providing an update on the current stock assessment progress, as well as talk a little bit about kind of the next steps after that assessment, where we think we'll end up in terms of maybe spatial reference points or more spatial information to inform the board, as well as some information on next steps that management can consider. So our current timeline is up on the screen right now, and we most recently had a data and methods workshop in October of 2023, which I'll go into some of the discussion and results of that workshop in my next slides. But we are currently right now in the process of gathering data to support the single species assessment update, as well as the multi-species assessments that are going to support the ERP models. At the end of this timeline, you will see we are anticipating presenting this to the board at annual meeting in 2025, following the peer review, which will be through the CDAR process in the summer, August of 2025. Our next big workshop is going to be the methods workshop part 2 in October of 2024, which is going to include one day for the SAS to discuss the assessment update, and then the rest of the time will be the ERP work group on the ERP assessment. So the next thing I wanted to talk about a little bit is basically what did we talk about at the data and methods workshop to give you an idea of where we're going with the ERP benchmark assessment. We met in October to review potential new data sources and discuss high priority model development tasks. A more detailed meeting summary is available online, but I'm just going to go through a few highlights of what was brought to us going forward. So as you know, we encourage and in fact put out a call for data for external collaborators or external researchers to bring data to these assessments for all of our assessments, so that it's not just, what have we used before in the past, what do we know that the states and the feds have. We have an opportunity to bring in other data sources. And so I'll go over some of the important ones that were presented from external researchers. The Nestle et al. Survey was not considered for inclusion in the assessment due to the short time series. This is basically just a snapshot, a pilot study. It really wasn't suitable for the assessment as a whole. But some of the weighted age information from that study showed some discrepancies with the weights used in the single species assessment. And so the ERP work group recommended that the SAS explore this particular issue in more depth using additional data sources as part of the assessment update. So the ERP work group remanded that to the SAS for further consideration. The next data source that was brought to us was from Dr. Alt and some of his colleagues presenting a reanalysis of the tagging data used to develop estimates of Menhaden natural mortality that resulted in a lower natural mortality than when he was using a different subset of the data and different methods. So this compared to what is currently used in the single species assessment. The ERP work group remanded this to the SAS as well, kind of recommending that some additional work be done to understand the differences between the data sets in question and conduct a sensitivity run with the lower natural mortality for consideration in the ERP models. The next data set was some information presented by Dr. Watts on the relationship between Menhaden and osprey in the Chesapeake Bay and other nearshore piscivorous birds that he has worked on. As well as the ERP work group reviewed some additional literature on marine mammal diets. So overall, the ERP work group found that the marine mammal and bird diet data and abundance data are still extremely limited coast-wide. So we have some good, very localized studies of individual aspects of this relationship, but overall the data are very limited. So the ERP recommended doing a comprehensive review of the existing data for birds and marine mammals to update the NWACS full model, that is the full EWE model, as a complement to the NWACS mice model, but at this point, not including birds or marine mammals in the NWACS mice model. Instead, we'll look to that sort of full comprehensive NWACS full model to support or provide context for the results from the NWACS mice model. Similarly, the ERP work group reviewed new diet information on bluefin tuna and blue catfish as potential additional predators within these models, and recommended exploring the inclusion of bluefin tuna further as the data were seemed sufficient, but not blue catfish for this assessment, as the more comprehensive data on the more comprehensive diet data studies for blue catfish indicated that menhaden was actually a relatively small component of their overall diet, and the geographical overlap with menhaden was limited basically to freshwater, less saline parts of the Chesapeake Bay. And so at this point, there's not a lot to be gained from including blue catfish in the NWACS mice model. And we may come back to this decision for future assessments as the spatial scope of blue catfish extends, or as our the spatial extent of the NWACS mice model changes. But at this point, we did not feel that that species was warranted inclusion. So in terms of, so those were the sort of the new data sources we examined, or at least the important high profile ones. In terms of high priority modeling tasks, the ERP work group identified the following as things we want to make sure we accomplish for this benchmark. So number one, incorporating seasonal dynamics into the NWACS mice model to better capture predator and prey temporal overlaps. Right now, we're just using an annual time step. The intent would be to go down to a monthly or seasonal time step to better capture some of that interaction and some of those overlaps, especially in terms of things like the Atlantic herring and striped bass overlap, which is a very intense relationship during certain times of the years, but has less overlap during other parts of the years. In addition, we'd like to incorporate bottom-up feedback into the Vader multi-species statistical catch-at-age model as a complement to the NWACS mice model, and to further develop that modeling framework as recommended by the peer review panel, as well as continued development and testing of a model that was not considered last time but might be useful this time around, the Wilberg et al. Age-structured predator-prey or simulation model, which can provide some interesting simulation capacity to support the NWACS mice and Vader models. Additional high priority modeling tasks include the incorporation of spatial dynamics into the NWACS mice model during this benchmark. Dave Shigaris et al. Have been funded through an SK grant to do this work for us, which will give us a lot more dedicated time from that group in order to advance this model. And in addition, the ERP work group is going to work on gathering additional data and reworking existing multi-species data to support a finer seasonal and spatial scale for model development. So that covers sort of where we are with the multi-species, the ERP benchmark assessment. I'm going to give a quick update on the single species assessment update. At this point, fishery independent data through 2023 have been submitted. Fishery dependent data are due essentially this month, and we are trying to have the base model runs completed in time for the October 2024 assessment or methods workshop. So in terms of the tasks that the SAS got from the ERP work group, the SAS was requested all available weight and age data from the states, and ended up with a very limited data to evaluate this issue for the 2025 update. So I think most of the work to resolve that question is probably going to have to come from the Neschledge and Schuler project that was recently funded. In terms of natural mortality, the SAS determined that changing M was not warranted at this time, as the current M is based on a peer-reviewed study that also was reviewed and accepted by the peer review panel at the last benchmark assessment. But number one, we'll conduct some alternate runs with a lower M estimate to support the ERP work. And we'll look further into the discrepancies between the data sources and other issues for those differences in the M estimates to help resolve this issue going forward. So I'm going to pivot a little bit now from sort of what has happened to what will happen and what is going to happen going forward to talk a little bit about the spatial ERP timeline. So this iteration of the NWACS mice model will incorporate more information on seasonal and spatial dynamics into the ERPs for this benchmark. However, the BAM single species model will remain a coast-wide model. There just is not time to develop a spatial model for the BAM. So if you remember this timeline from the ERP workgroup memo, we presented this in April of 2021, I think when we were initially talking about this, that as we want to develop more spatial ERPs that can provide a quantitative estimate of what an acceptable bay cap is, or more quantitative information on what's happening in the bay, there's sort of different scales of approaches ranging from sort of a more coarse spatial scale with minimal additional data requirements down to a very fine spatial scale that will have significant additional data and modeling requirements. And so the timeline for most of that was sort of between 5 years and 10 years, 10 plus years, depending on the options that we chose. So the board decision at the time, next slide, was not to delay the 2025 assessment in order to pursue any of those spatial options, but instead sort of go forward and stay to this 2025 timeline. So the option that we're sort of going forward with was not actually on that list, as you may have now noticed. So we're going with a more spatially explicit NWACS mice model to get more spatially informed ERPs, but we will still be using the coast-wide BAM, or the coast-wide single species model. And so the ERPs will definitely be improved by this. We'll have a more refined reference point that will better capture the spatial and seasonal dynamics of Menhaden and their key predators, and help us get to a reference point that is better scientifically, but it likely will not provide quantitative advice about the bay cap. So we'll still be working within sort of a coast-wide reference point system. So what we will get out at the end, sort of in a management framework, is going to, at the 2025 annual meeting, we will receive, you will receive, I will give, or my team will give, a presentation of the ERP and the single species assessments. So this will give the board will actually have a chance to kind of reconsider the target and threshold reference point definitions for ERPs at this meeting. This is a little different from many of our other sort of single species approaches, where we come to you and we say, here's your reference point, here's your F 40% and your SSB 40%, this is your target and your threshold, and that's it. It's been updated, it has new information, but sort of that definition is the same. If you recall, the tool that we provided through this process is really giving you ways to evaluate the trade-offs between menhaden harvest and predator abundance and the allowable predator fishing mortality rates. And so the current definition for our ERPs is that this is our target is the F rate that will allow striped bass to stay at their biomass target when striped bass are fished at their F target, and all the other species in the model are fished at sort of the status quo in 2017. That's one possible definition. That's the definition we went forward with. I think at this point, when we come back to you, we will again present this tool, and the board will have the option of considering potential other definitions in terms of what should the F rates on striped bass be, what should the F rates on other species in the model be when we are defining what our Menhaden reference point should be. The board is not obligated to change in any way. I think that the definition that we have right now is still a viable definition on the table, but we will have the board will have the opportunity to reconsider some of those management trade-offs and management objectives within this ecosystem framework at that 2025 annual meeting. And changes to the reference point can be made through the board action or through adaptive management. You'll also have to do specifications at this meeting, which may make trying to change that definition a little more complicated. We'll try to make that, the options on the table as easy as possible for you guys, but I think we just wanted to highlight that this is a complex system with a lot of moving parts. We won't have quantitative advice probably on the bay cap at that point, although there are always other qualitative approaches that this board can take. And we'll be presenting a tool that's maybe a little more complicated than the traditional SPR-based reference points that we have for our single species assessments. And so there's a lot of moving parts that are going to come together at this meeting, and a lot of things for the board to think about. I'm not saying you have to start this conversation now. We do still have a year and a half to figure out a lot of these issues, but just to kind of prepare this in everyone's mind for kind of what's coming down the road, where we are now, where we're going, and where you guys are going to have to make some decisions in terms of management objectives in about a year and a half. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions.